Is Viviana the best arts fighter? Yes. Why are you still here? You have your answer. Go home. No. Ignore the asterisk. She's great. What more do you need? Okay, fine. Let's try this again. Is Viviana the best arts fighter? Yes. Sometimes. Happy? In another case of gameplay matching lore, Viviana has had it rough since her release, for a number of reasons. For one, between her skill 2 and especially her skill 3 basically requiring investment for them to be usable, and her debut event almost being entirely made up of enemies with 50 plus res, which would reduce her damage there by 50% or more, anyone who got her on release and wanted to just test her out before fully investing in her was gonna just have an awful first impression. And while the Vivi fan part of my brain maintains that once invested in, she was a lot better than people made her out to be, the reality is that she left her launch event with the reputation of being, if not the worst 6-star, maybe the most disappointing. People had been looking forward to the character from Near Light and the boss from CC8, not a durable one-block unit whose damage wasn't going to be setting the world on fire. Meanwhile, she had the burden of being the second 6-star arts fighter. That was going to be rough for whoever it ended up being, no matter their kit, but when you combine that first impression with there being such an obvious comparison, fair or not, there wasn't really any chance for her to escape that. And I don't like doing this. Comparing units and their roles can give some context to help people understand how to use operators. But in a game where only whales have every character, there's a limit to how useful it is when you might not even have both units. When the conversation around a character is just, don't even bother building them, this other character is better, it offers nothing to the people who don't have that other character. But even now, as the arts fighters get their mods, the comparison remains, and even while Viviana is the clear winner of the mods, to repair her reputation, just being better than she was isn't enough. For better or worse, she has to stand next to Surtr. But to get to that, we have to talk about her kit, why so many people had so many problems with it, and just what she can do now that she has her Delta mod. Viviana is an arts fighter, meaning she has one block and her attacks deal arts damage, which feels weirdly simple compared to more recent archetypes like Shaper Casters and Alchemists, but hey, it makes my job explaining it easier. Viviana's first talent increases the arts damage she deals by 8% or 9% with potential 5, and reduces the physical and arts damage she takes by the same percentage. And when there's an elite or boss in her range, both of those numbers are doubled. Her second talent gives her an 18% chance, or 20% chance with potential 3, to create a shield when she's attacking an elite or boss. These shields block one melee attack and do not stack. It's nothing too flashy, but it's a pretty nice set of talents, giving her a nice boost to her damage while giving the foundation for her being a pretty tanky unit, especially on skill, but even outside of that too. And it starts to point towards her specialization against elites and bosses. Her mod, the reason we're all talking about her now, affects her first talent, dealing an additional 9% of her arts damage as burn damage. This number is not directly affected by her fifth potential and is just 9% regardless, but like the other aspects of her first talent, is doubled when there's an elite or boss in her range. Meanwhile, the trait change lets her deal extra elemental damage when an enemy is under the burn effect. Also, it gives her enough extra HP that she can do this now. This is a really good mod, as pretty much all of the elemental damage mods are, but it has some differences from the others that make it work uniquely well both with her kit and with the larger elemental damage mechanics. For all the others, the trait change is what lets them inflict their elemental status, and the talent changes are what give them the extra elemental damage to enemies under that status. But Viviana changes it up, doing it the other way around. And because it's on the talent that gets doubled when elites or bosses are in her range, this means that she applies her status better than just about any of the others with these mods. Plus, It's burn damage, and while that deals less damage than Necrosis, dealing an instant 7k versus Necrosis's 12k damage over time, and it only lasts 10 seconds to Necrosis's 15, it also gives a minus 20 res debuff to enemies under the effect, effectively solving Viviana's struggles against enemy resistances and letting her boost your whole squad's arch damage. And because of the shorter duration and her focus on elemental buildup, she can actually apply the status 2 or 3 times per skill to a wide range of enemies. But beyond that, one of the main ways that elemental damage has been balanced, as HG tries to keep it from completely trivializing all content, is that bosses require twice the buildup before they trigger any elemental status. But when she deals twice the elemental damage to bosses, she can keep up with their bigger elemental HP pools and still apply the burn status really effectively, even against pretty high res thresholds. But the real kicker is that she also gets this bonus against elites who do not have the extra elemental HP. And as a result, she can just mow those fuckers down, easily taking advantage of the burn effect's res debuff and the bonus elemental damage from her trait change. While the comparisons to the other arts fighters are inevitable, and something I'll talk about as we get deeper into Vivi's kit, her ability to just destroy elites actually prompts maybe a more fitting comparison, ironically to the subject of my last guide, Ebenholz. While I think Eben has a higher ceiling in terms of what he can do, Vivi has a decidedly lower skill floor, so if you wanted someone who could wipe out elites without breaking a sweat, but thought Eben was a bit too difficult or involved, Viviana might be the perfect unit for you. But before you decide that, I should probably talk about her skills too. Her S1 is a lot like most 6-star S1s, in that you use it only until you unlock something else. It increases her attack and her attack hits twice, and if she doesn't use it right away, it'll keep charging, after which it'll hit 3 times and have an extended range. When a unit has space to use these automatic kind of power strike skills, it's often because of long cooldowns on their other skills, or because of some other utility that the skill offers. And even then, they're usually fringe picks. Vivi's S1 doesn't even have that going for it. Each of the hits have separate targeting, so if the first hit kills an enemy and there's another enemy in range, the remaining strike will hit that one, which is kind of neat, but not really useful. Meanwhile, S2 and S3 already have good uptime and quick charges. It lacks the defensive bonuses that S2 and S3 give, and now with her mod, it's worse at applying burn damage than them, making the damage gap between these skills even wider. What's more is that masteries only give 17.6% more attack and absolutely no SP reduction, meaning that even if you want to use it now and then, you don't really need to invest in it to do so. It's pretty much going to be the same experience. Also, yes, I know I'm saying this is a bad skill and that's contingency contract footage where I'm using it, but ignore that. It's not a good skill. I've been using her on every map since she launched, and that's the only time I've found a serious use for it. Viviana's S2 is her Estesia power creep skill. It increases her attack, defense, and block count unless her attack enemies equal to the number of her block count. Plus, it gives her a chance to crit, which does more damage, hits twice, and steals attack speed. Unfortunately, she's limited to only gaining from the stolen attack speed once, otherwise we'd have a supersonic moose on our hands, but otherwise it's a really nice skill. While most of the time I or anyone else talk about her, we talk about her S3. But don't sleep on her S2 either. While S3 is her main dueling skill, this one works really well at letting her deal with lanes that have a solid mix of elites and trash mobs, with her increased block and multi-target letting her filter out the weaker enemies, and her increased defense lets her hold up like a brick wall to any physical damage dealing elites. In fact, that defense increase is no joke, putting her on par or ahead of many defenders before you even factor in her damage reduction or shields. Both S2 and S3 can surprise you with how often she can get away without any healing, but her S2 is really something else. I've gone as far as having her live through an entire CCP side map without any healing, which is a wild thing for any guard to be doing, especially since this was before her burn mod too, so now she has double the damage. You'd be forgiven for thinking of it less as a DPS skill, given that it just increases her attack by 40% at M3, compared to increasing her defense by 160%. But it actually has really solid damage too, especially after the mod. That attack boost might seem small, but when you get into the math, it actually works out really well. Her crits are attack scale, meaning it's a rare case of one skill having two separate attack multipliers. Not to mention the attack speed boost and double hit on crits, and they basically crammed every single way of increasing damage into a single skill. And unless you get totally screwed over by crit RNG, the result is pretty solid. Though as I get into the numbers on this, I want to shout out Erican for doing the calculations on this one. Vivi's S2 has RNG, and that's fine for its usage. Sure, sometimes it'll hit harder than others, but generally it does what you need it more. However, this RNG makes it hell to actually put together any kind of DPS numbers. For reasons I'm just going to put up on the screen for a sec instead of getting into a tangent about it. But the TLDR is that to actually get the median damage, you have to build a whole simulation for it. And I wasn't going to do that. I'd already done S3 calculations, along with, as you'll see, calculations for the other 6-star Arts fighters to give a sense of how Vivi's S3 stacks up. But since her S2 didn't have an obvious point of comparison for those other units, I was just going to skip that. But Erican did it, so huge shout out to them. Go give them a sub, they do some pretty cracked Choose NG only clears, and make some of the best use of Viviana in that squad that I've seen. But anyway, her S2 has, on a typical activation, over half the single target DPS of her S3, and since it lasts 10 seconds longer, it has some pretty respectable total damage as well. Add on to that the fact that it gives her multi-target and an extra block, and it can be great for cases where S3 would be overkill and you need her to deal with a larger crowd. Or for more extreme situations like with Mudrock Colossi or Babel Burden Beasts where no one is deleting them right away and you need her to be able to deal with other enemies at the same time instead of letting them walk by while she deals with the bigger threat. This is probably the best any of the 6-star Arts fighters do at dealing with heavier crowds, and that's a worthwhile investment in my eyes. Her S3 is still her main skill, don't get me wrong, but it's more of a 70-30 split with the usage of them, which is a lot closer than a lot of 6-stars. If you only give her masteries on one skill, I'd still recommend S3, though that's as much because it's comparatively unusable at skill level 7 versus M3, but I'd still strongly consider this one if you have the extra mats. Her S3 is a beast of a skill, but it's also probably the most criticized part of her kit. It increases her attack, makes each attack hit 3 times, and prioritize elite and boss enemies, increases her defense and res, and increases the odds of the shield talent triggering, while lasting 25 seconds. The thing is, that's only from her second activation on. On its first activation, it only hits twice and lasts 15 seconds, compared to the 3 times and 25 seconds on her full activation. This means that she needs 47 seconds from her deployment to get to the first full activation. And that's a pretty big deal when her first activation can only do... Yeah, so that's the thing. Her first activation deals burn damage too. No, the mod didn't eliminate the need for her to ramp up, and the difference between the 2 activations is still substantial. But it made so much of a jump in power for that first activation that it often doesn't matter. Like when the first activation can phase a boss, sure it may take some time for her to get to her full power, but it sure won't feel like she's just sitting there doing nothing. In fact, the mod gives her so much of a boost that even the first activation generally has higher DPS than her no mod full activation. Again, this isn't to say that it isn't still a limitation, that was only NL 10 Blood Knight after all. But don't write it off entirely because the next activation will be stronger. But the other complaint against her, and largely against her S3, is that even though on paper it compares well to Surtr's S3, giving her plus 110% attack and hitting 3 times, while Surtr gets plus 330% attack and hits once, it never lived up to that, given Surtr's Res Ignore being way more impactful than Viviana's Talent 1 boost to Arts damage, as that boost is applied after Res has already cut down the damage. Now, burn damage can help her with this, as it does apply a debuff that reduces enemy res by 20, but 1, she has to be able to damage them to apply that in the first place, and 2, that's still less than Surtr, who has up to 26 res ignore with potentials and her mod, and just like at all times, no prerequisites required. So, is this enough for Vivi to finally be competitive? Well, yeah, you could say that. While before, Vivi lost out around 15 res. Now, against bosses, she's ahead until 60, after which she remains comparable until 80. And against elites, it's even better, being ahead until 80 and only dropping off at 95. And it's worth noting that I'm talking about Surtr with her mod, so the Surtr damage that everyone's experienced before now, which is also shown on the graphs, gets beaten out even harder. And all that on a 25 SP charge time. It's a hell of a change, I'll tell you that. And not to get too deep into the math talk, but res values where the DPS are close are ultimately too close to call, even if it does show that Surtr is slightly ahead. The graphs measure average DPS, and for Vivi, the minute-to-minute DPS is highly variable. She starts off slower as she applies burn, and when the burn triggers and deals its 7,000 elemental damage, she gets a sharp spike, and then she continues to deal damage at a faster rate than she did outside of the burn window. Then, after the window is over, she goes back to the initial rate of damage, and the process repeats. Those bursts in her DPS mean that her damage can overtake Surtr for a period, and if an enemy's HP runs out during that window, it may mean that she takes them out before Surtr does. If the enemy's HP runs out during the slower portion, or neither beats them in that window, well then Surtr beats her out with slightly higher total damage. So, as long as those lines are close, the practical DPS leader is entirely enemy dependent. You can actually see this with both of them fighting Jesselton, where technically Surtr should be ahead, but because he dies during Vivi's burn burst, Vivi actually wins that race. So Viviana beats Surtr's damage. Does that mean she's the best arts fighter now? Are we all going to be saying just Vivi it from now on? Well, no, that's not the full picture either. I've tried to make it as fair as possible, with all units at max level and potential, and both Vina and Surtr maintaining their mod's attack speed condition for the duration, but there are still things that these numbers don't reflect. For one, I've limited this to 25 seconds, the duration of both Vivi and Vina's S3s, and Surtr can technically last longer. However, there are also cases where those two can finish their skills, but Surtr falls early, so that felt like a fair compromise. But the bigger things are that 1, as I already mentioned, this is Vivi's full activation and doesn't account for her ramp up, and 2, that this is all single target, and both Vina and Surtr have multi-target S3s. Okay, so then it's still Surtr, or maybe Vina who's best now? Well, that's not quite it either. Numbers will only get you so far in understanding a unit, whether that be DPS, how many enemies a unit can hit, SP cost, or whatever. The key is how they all come together, and understanding how that relates to the content you'll be playing. Viviana has generally better than Surtr single target damage, letting her mow down elites and most bosses, all on a 25 SP cooldown, no redeploy required. In daily content, and a lot of more challenging content, she can massively simplify any stage by wiping out all of its most difficult enemies, while being durable enough that you don't have to worry about her being able to get her damage in. She has short downtimes, helping mitigate the risk associated with using a 1-block unit, and a multi-target 2-block S2 for when you need her to deal with crowds alongside major elites. She pairs really well with buffs, whether that's from game modes like IS or from various synergies from other operators, as those boost her arts and her burn damage, though she works great without any of that too. But she's not the universal best pick either. For one, it's not just that her S3 lets her stay out on the field, it's that she has to if you want to get the most out of her. Sure, that first activation is a lot stronger than it used to be, but it's not like it's competing with Surtr right off the bat. And in game modes like Contingency Contract that can heavily restrict your deployment limit, the fact that she has to stay out on the field for so long can seriously restrict her ability to fit into a squad. Additionally, modifiers that decrease her attack can reduce her ability to inflict burn, further limiting her in those game modes. Her S3 is also still only single target, and while her S2 gives her multi-target and is a very good skill in its own right, you still have to choose between the upper limit of her damage and her ability to take out crowds, rather than getting both in one skill. Surtr is basically the exact mirror of this. She doesn't just focus on one enemy, but everything in whatever direction she's looking. She has an incredibly fast startup at only 5 seconds. She has guaranteed resignore that cannot be affected by any CC modifiers. And when she dies, she doesn't, lasting up to 9 more seconds. But she will die, and when she does, you'll need to take a full 70 seconds to redeploy her, or even longer with redeployment time risks for contingency contracts, plus 5 seconds to charge her skill again. A window in which Vivi can use her skill, charge it, and use it again. I think it's really fascinating how well the two reflect each other's strengths and weaknesses now, but ultimately because of her undying talent, resignore, and quick startup, Surtr tends to get a bit more use in high difficulty content. I think that might be some people's nail in the coffin for Vivi, but before you pass your final judgment, I also want to back up a second to consider the broader game. The reality is that Surtr usually isn't the first pick for high difficulty content anymore either. She still shows up there, sure, but usually as a supplemental pick for when she fits the squad, rather than the DPS unit around which you build an entire clear like she was for so many of the original contingency contracts. Surtr just isn't meta-defining anymore. She's good, strong, and still a very respectable unit, and one that's absolutely worth using if you have her. But we should tell she is not. And that's okay. My point isn't that she's bad or anything now, though I know some people hear that someone isn't meta-defining and immediately assume they're unusable. But rather that that's exactly where Viviana is too. No, she's not moving the needle in terms of the meta, but she's strong, reliable, and a worthy addition to your roster. And as much as I've kind of ignored her so far, Vina is in a similar spot as well. Even with a certain unnamed Sienna operator, she's still the biggest source of true damage in the game, and between her Frighten debuff and S3 summons, she can take a lot of pressure off of your units and give you a window to burst down whatever is the source of that threat in the first place. Plus, like Vivi, she can stay out on the field. But she doesn't really infringe on what the others are doing either. For one, she has a 15-second heli drop versus Surtr's 5 seconds, and that's a huge difference at high-end play. And she has a 50 SP cost for her S3, which is not only twice as long as Vivi's SP cost, but actually takes longer to charge than it does for Vivi to go through her entire S3 ramp up. And again, to remind you, Vivi has a pretty solid first activation during that ramp up, and only has to do it once. But she still has her uses, fitting in nicely in your everyday roster, particularly when you're up against enemies with damage reduction or dodge, and in some advanced scenarios too. Personally, I don't think any one is universally better than the others, but rather that they're just different units that excel in different circumstances, each with their own compelling use cases. And considering where 6-star Archfighter started off, where Viviana was at her release, and the fact that they've all released over a spread of 4 years, that's pretty remarkable. So, to answer the original question, yes, Viviana is the best Archfighter. But sometimes, the others are too. Anyway, thanks for watching. This one was pretty tough to put together. Viviana is my favorite character, but I did my best to cool any bias I had and approach this fairly. At the end of the day, I can't tell you to build her. All I can do is set out her strengths and weaknesses and let you decide for yourself. But let me know what you think in the comments. Does Vivi set herself apart now that she has her Delta mod? Is Surtr just too much to overcome? Or maybe Vina's the queen of the archetype after all? Anyway, like, comment, subscribe, you know the drill. And let me know in the comments if there are any other underappreciated operators you'd like me to maybe give a spotlight next time. Until then, auf Wiedersehen.